The biblical holiday Hanukkah is famous for the lighting of the menorah over 8 days. Yeah, we know that, but what most don't realize is that it is an extremely prophetic holiday that someday will greatly impact every single human alive on earth. Hanukkah is the hidden template for the Antichrist in the Great Tribulation. That's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. In today's world, we think of Hanukkah as a nice, happy little holiday, kind of like the Jewish Christmas, where kids receive gifts, homes are lit with lights, we eat potato pancakes, and sing a crazy song by Adam Sandler. Put on your yarmulke, here comes Hanukkah. You know the one. But it's not just a nice, fun, secular holiday. It's an amazing prophetic revelation of the end times. The Antichrist, the abomination of desolation, the persecution of God's people, and Jesus' ultimate victory over the forces of darkness. If you want to know what these things will look like in the future, knowing what they looked like in the Hanukkah story is key. In fact, Hanukkah may be the secret to understanding the mysterious numbers of days found in Daniel 12, 1260, 1290, 1335. There are 75 days between 1260 days and 1335 days, and exactly 75 days between the holidays of Yom Kippur and Hanukkah. This is one important holiday if this proves true, and Hanukkah actually is the 1335th day found in Daniel. But shockingly, it is only mentioned by name in one place in the Bible. Where do you think that is? It's in the New Testament. And the only one we see celebrating it is Jesus. The Hebrew word Hanukkah means dedication. So, in the Gospel of John, when we read at that time, the Feast of Dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the porticos of Solomon. It's speaking of Hanukkah. Also notice it says, at that time. At what time? At the time of Jesus' miracle in John 9 and his teaching in John 10. All of these things happened at the time of the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. So John 10 is Jesus' Hanukkah teaching, and that is where we're going to begin. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up by some other way, he is a thief and a robber. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus contrasts himself with the thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Who is the thief? The ultimate coming thief is the Antichrist, who is coming to steal the sheep. Speaking about the Antichrist at Hanukkah is very appropriate because historically, the greatest foreshadow of the Antichrist, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is the villain of the historic Hanukkah account. His name, Antiochus, even sounds like Antichrist. That's why Jesus' teaching at this time is about his great end-time enemy, the thief. And if you want to know what the Antichrist is like, where he's from, and what he's going to do, we need to study Hanukkah and Antiochus because historic accounts exactly match what's going to happen in the future according to prophecy. And in this video, we're going to match those prophecies to the Hanukkah account. Now, if you're new to this channel, we use Scripture to interpret Scripture and current world events. If that's important to you, well, consider joining us by subscribing. We'll appreciate your viewpoints in the comments as well. This historic information we're talking about is primarily found in the book of Maccabees and also in Josephus, the greatest Jewish historian. Now, Maccabees is not found in the canon of the Bible. It's part of what we call the Apocrypha, And it's not inspired. Instead, it's a history book, and we should read it like a historical account. These historical accounts parallel prophecies in the book of Daniel. Does this mean that Daniel was completely fulfilled by these ancient accounts? No, not at all. The historical information in Maccabees is a first fulfillment of Daniel, a first fulfillment only. For instance, let's look at an example in the Daniel prophecy, and then the historical account, and then what Jesus says about this same thing. First, here is Daniel. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. Next, let's look at the historic record. Now on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrifice upon the altar of burnt offering. I am sure those in Israel, in the days of Jesus, thought that this event in Maccabees fulfilled Daniel's prophecy of the abomination of desolation. However, look what Jesus had to say. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, he's referring back to the Daniel 11 verse that we looked at before, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The disciples were probably surprised, maybe even shocked, when they heard Jesus say this. They thought the abomination of desolation was over and done back in the days of Antiochus, but Jesus was telling them there was yet one more fulfillment of this abomination of desolation, a future fulfillment of this prophecy, that the abomination of Antiochus was just a foreshadow. And this type of dual fulfillment continues throughout the entire Hanukkah account. This is what makes the Hanukkah story the template for the Antichrist and the Great Tribulation. And as you are about to find out, there are some amazing things in the Hanukkah story not found in prophecy. Now, if those things also happen, well, this gives us great insight by knowing this account, insight we wouldn't know strictly from prophecy. So keep watching. Even if you know prophecy, you might not know these additional factors. So let's start with this character Antiochus Epiphanes, which means God manifest. Yes, he called himself God. Sounds familiar, kind of like the Antichrist, doesn't it? His contemporaries, however, called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus the madman, because he was a little crazy. Now, Antiochus IV was the son of Antiochus III and a potential heir to the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire was in the area of eastern Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. Will the future Antichrist arise out of that same area? Daniel 8:9 seems to indicate that the little horn or Antichrist will come from this area. But, of course, only time will tell. However, unfortunately for Antiochus, his dad lost some battles to the new empire on the block. You may have heard of this empire, the Romans. And in the peace treaty between the two nations, Antiochus's dad gave Antiochus to the Romans as a political prisoner. Yes, can you imagine being given away by your dad to the enemy? This was not uncommon in those days. The Romans figured that the Seleucids would keep their end of the treaty if the royal son was their prisoner. This may have prophetic implications. Might the Antichrist first be the political prisoner of the Western nations prior to rising to power? The former caliph of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, was just such a prisoner during the USA-Iraq War. And at that time, I remember wondering about this link to the Hanukkah story when he came to power. Might the Antichrist follow a similar path? Well, maybe. It's certainly something for all of us to keep in mind. Getting back to Antiochus, he was released by the Romans and was living in Greece when the king of Pergamum, yes, where the throne of Satan is, Pergamum from Revelation 2:13, that Pergamum, that king secretly helped him enter the Seleucid Empire, and by means of intrigue, he became king, even killing his young nephew to assume total power. This matches Daniel's prophecy. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. To which you might say, hey, wait a minute, Nelson, that prophecy relates to the Antichrist. And it does. It's a dual fulfillment, just as we have been pointing out, both Antiochus and the Antichrist. Now, as soon as Antiochus came to power, the king of the south, the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt, decided to attack Antiochus, thinking his empire was still weak after all the political intrigue. But Antiochus was prepared, sneak attacked first, and defeated the Egyptians. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Again, although this is primarily about the Antichrist, the parallels with Antiochus are almost perfect. Antiochus then led a second attack on Egypt, but a single, elderly Roman ambassador directed Antiochus to withdraw his armies from Egypt, or Rome would attack the Seleucids. The Roman drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, "Before you leave this circle, give me a reply that I can take back to the Roman Senate." This is where we get the famous saying, "a line in the sand," and Antiochus, afraid of the Romans, withdrew. It parallels Daniel as well. At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw. Again, we see how the eventual career of the Antichrist is paralleled by the historic account of Antiochus. Now, Antiochus was only opposed by a single individual, not a fleet of ships as the Antichrist will be, but the parallel is still there. Immediately after that, Antiochus undertook what he is most famous for. He shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and give heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the continual burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And those among the people who are wise shall make many understand, although they shall fall by sword and flame and by captivity and plunder for some days. He entered Israel, took away the sacrifices, and set up the abomination of desolation. Maccabees tells us that the Israelites themselves actually began the apostasy previously. They had built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and were trying to become like Greeks. I think this is another one of the hidden gems in the Hanukkah account, that a very large contingent of the Jews themselves were the ones forsaking the faith first, prior to the king committing the abomination, prior to Antiochus. Will that happen in the future with the Antichrist? Will the Jews adopt the Gentile practices of the Turkish-Syrian Antichrist willingly, and on their own prior to the abomination? Probably yes. Every other aspect has been following the historic account. So many say the Jews will never accept a foreign non-Jewish Antichrist. Well, that's not true. It has happened before, and I think it's likely it will happen again. Josephus the historian then tells us what happened when the abomination was set up. The king went up to Jerusalem, and by pretending to offer peace, overcame the city by treachery. But on this occasion he did not spare even those who admitted him, because of the wealth of the temple, but through greed. He saw much gold in the temple and an array of very costly, dedicatory offerings of other kinds. And for the sake of taking this as spoil, he went so far as to violate the treaty which he had made with them. And so he stripped the temple, carrying off the vessels of God, the golden lampstands, and the golden altar, and the table, and other altars, and not even forbearing to take the curtains, which were made of fine linen and scarlet. He also emptied the temple of its hidden treasures, and left nothing at all behind, thereby throwing the Jews into deep mourning. From Antiquity of the Jews 12.5.4. Notice that greed was an overwhelming motivation in the abomination then, and likely will be again. In this previous video, we discussed how the treasures of Solomon's original temple may be uncovered in the near future. There's a link down in the description if you want to see it. And these priceless items may be a motivation for the coming Antichrist as well. Josephus further tells us Antiochus stopped sacrifices for 3.5 years, just like the Antichrist will in the future. In Daniel 9:27, it says sacrifices are stopped at the midpoint of 7 years, or 3.5 years. And in Revelation 11:2, it says the holy place or temple is trampled for 42 months. Again, this is 3.5 years, just like as in the original Antiochus account. And then Josephus tells us Antiochus set up the abomination. And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice, neither according to the law, nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. As we have seen earlier in this video, this event was known as the abomination of desolation, until the time of Jesus, that is. Now we know an even greater event is coming. And immediately after this, Antiochus began a great persecution of the Jews. The books of the law, which they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or if anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned them to death. They kept using violence against Israel, against those found month after month in the cities. And on the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar, which was the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and the families of those circumcising them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. Jesus tells us in Matthew 24:21 that in the same way, after the future abomination of desolation, a great tribulation or persecution of God's people will break out, but this time it will be one that affects the whole world and not just the nation of Israel. Maccabees details the resistance as to what happened in the 2nd century BC. Then the king's officers, who were enforcing the apostasy, came to the city of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. A Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice upon the altar in Modin according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger, and he ran and killed him upon the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's official who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, as Phinehas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. Then Mattathias cried out in the city with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." And he and his sons fled to the hills and left all they had in the city. This also exactly parallels Jesus' command that in the future, those who refuse the Antichrist are to run to the mountains. Matthew 24:16. The parallels just keep coming, don't they? You can see why Hanukkah and the Hanukkah account is such an excellent source for those wanting to know what the end times will be like. Now, Mattathias' son, Judah Maccabee, then led the revolt against Antiochus, and after many battles in which they were greatly outnumbered, he finally defeated Antiochus and then rededicated the temple. And that rededication is what is celebrated at Hanukkah. Here is how Maccabees records it. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offerings, which had been profaned, and they thought it best to tear it down, lest it bring reproach upon them. For the Gentiles had defiled it, so they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until there should come a prophet to tell them what to do with them. They then took unhewn stones, as the law directs, and built a new altar, like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they burned incense on the altar, lighted the lamps of the lampstand, and those gave light in the temple. Now, if every other aspect of a Hanukkah account is paralleled by future events, will this one be also? Will Jesus be the prophet described here? Although he is the Messiah, the Jews of this era sometimes referred to the Messiah as the prophet that was greater than Moses. Will he show the priests where the old original altar stones are hidden and reconstruct the altar with them? It is certainly something to consider. I find it very interesting. And of course, the menorah brings light to the temple. Hanukkah revolves around the menorah and oil. In the parable of the 10 virgins, oil for their lamps is what determined the difference between the wise virgins and the foolish virgins. So you probably want to know about the miracle of the oil that didn't run out for 8 days, right? It's the most famous part of the Hanukkah story. Well, there is nothing in Maccabees about it, nothing in Josephus. It is a rabbinic fable only. It could be true, but I think it's unlikely. So personally, when my family celebrates Hanukkah, we stress the rededication aspect. We are the temple of God on earth, after all, and we use this temple to rededicate ourselves to the Lord, to keep our lamps burning, just like the virgins. Let your loins be girded and your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting on their master to come home from the marriage feast, so that they may open to him at once when he comes and knocks. Now, back in the days of Antiochus, in Israel they installed sinful men as leaders of culture, education, and government. Evil was good and good was evil, just as we're seeing today. And in those days, a wicked priest led Antiochus into the temple. Will a similar wicked priest prepare the way for Antichrist? To keep watching, we'll click right here and discover who that wicked priest might be and why the Jews might follow him. It's kind of like a Pied Piper. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.